All right, we're going to get started. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the Local Cultural Council member training. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate those who were recently appointed to their local cultural council, where I hope you're feeling excited and energized for the grant cycle. So, my name is Jay. I'm one of the program officers where I oversee the LCCs and cultural districts in Greater Boston, Southeastern Mass, and Hampshire County. My co-facilitator tonight will be Greg Torales, who oversees the local cultural councils and cultural districts in Greater Merrimack Valley and South Central Mass. Tonight, we also have two of our other team members, Cheyenne and Summers, who will be helping us answer any questions that you guys may have. So if you have questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A option. Cheyenne and Summers will be dropping in links in the chat throughout the webinar, and we don't want your questions to get lost in the chat. So again, please use the Q&A option. Additionally, we have our amazing team members that can't be with us tonight, but they are Lisa Simmons, Timothea Pham, Carolyn Cole, who will also be available to you throughout the grant cycle in your respective regions. And lastly, we have Andrea and Joy, who will be helping us out with ASL interpreting tonight. Yep. Oh, sorry. Okay. This session is specifically going to be focused on the guidelines that all appointed local cultural council members must abide by. Tonight, we'll be diving into what your roles and responsibilities are going to be on your local cultural council. So let's get started. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton to my co-facilitator, Greg, to talk about the LCC program.
Thank you so much, Jay. Out of respect to all of the LCC members here, I did draft like a 21-page talking point document, which I am now going to throw out. I'm shooting from the hip here. This is meant to be fun and low stress. So just kind of a brief LCC program overview. The Local Cultural Council program is run obviously by us, the Mass Cultural Council, which is your state arts agency that funds the arts, humanities, and sciences. And essentially, we distribute grant funds, public funds, through two particular channels. So one is through direct grants, either through individuals or some of our organization-based grant programs, all of which are going through statewide competitive processes. And the other, which is the main reason that you are all here today, is through the LCC program. So each year, each of the 329 LCCs receive an allocation that they then use to re-grant those funds for various things, which we will talk about as we go forward. I did mention that there are 329 LCCs throughout the state. There are, about 351 cities and towns across Massachusetts. Some of those smaller towns have actually regionalized, and they have kind of formed smaller pockets known as regional cultural councils throughout the state. The program background section really has a nice overview of the history of the program itself, and it also provides a list of the regional cultural councils that we have. The main document is linked on the bottom of this page. This is the new LCC guidelines document, which we've updated last July. So in addition to this training today, you'll also want to make sure to kind of thoroughly go through that document, especially if this is your first time serving as a new LCC member. Next slide, please. All right, so essentially here, what we're going to go ahead and elaborate on is each of these 6 points. So there are several responsibilities that befall LCCs in general and specifically LCC members. So first and foremost, this first point, this is probably how you all have got here today. LCCs want to make sure that they are doing recruitment on an ongoing basis. So this isn't something that's done once a year. This is really something that's done continuously. And as part of that process, you'll also want to assign specific roles for LCCs, which we will talk about in a little bit. Next, this is another critical point. LCCs want to conduct community input as a way of establishing which local priorities and guidelines they want to elect as they go into the grant cycle, again, which we will talk about in a little bit as well. Third, communication is a big part. So this is also an ongoing thing. LCCs regularly communicate with their communities. In particular, they do so heavily throughout the fall as a launch to the actual grant cycle. And there's other aspects of communication that we will talk about as well throughout this presentation. The fourth point is critical over the fall. So once the grant cycle is open, and you are in the midst of actually reviewing applications, that's another significant part of what LCCs do, is actually review and recommend applications, essentially. Lastly, there is a set of annual reporting that is done. We try to keep that as simplistic as possible, and we are here to help you with that process. But throughout the year, there are 3 separate reports that LCCs submit directly to us. And then lastly, as you could imagine, it is a state agency, so I don't think we can do a presentation and not use the word comply, but you do have to comply with all LCC guidelines, rulings, and associated laws, which again, we are here to help you all in doing so. And I'll go to the next slide, please. All right, so this one is fun. So now we're going to get a little bit more specific into the recruitment side of things. As I mentioned, this is an ongoing process that LCCs do. At minimum, each LCC needs to have 5 voting members in order to be functional, at most 22. And in terms of the roles that I mentioned earlier, LCCs want to make sure that they elect one chairperson, or in some cases, we're working with some LCCs that have 2 co-chairs, so 2 folks who are essentially dividing that responsibility up between them. You'll also want a secretary and a treasurer, and we have links all the way on the bottom where it says the membership section. We actually have sample job descriptions where we elaborate not only on these key roles, but other supporting administrative roles that LCCs can also assign to particular members. Now, when we switch gears and we talk about LCC members in general, you want to make sure that anyone on the LCC has demonstrated, at the very least, an interest in the arts, humanities, and sciences. LCC members, when they come on board, they are essentially committing to a 3-year term. And LCC members can also serve 2 consecutive years. If they do that, first off, at that point, they've committed 6 years to this, which is amazing. They do have to take a 1-year kind of quote unquote cool off period. So they have to leave the LCC for at least a year. However, when we say leave in this particular context, they can still remain on board in an ex officio capacity. So what that means is they basically lose their voting privileges, but they could still remain on the board for their kind of cool off year in a supportive capacity before coming back again to serve their regular 3-year term, where they would then get their voting privileges back. And lastly, keep in mind, and this is something that's included within your appointment letters from your town or city, you have to take the mandatory state ethics training annually. Fun fact, we just got ours scheduled for November. We're going to be doing ours again coming up. And a few things that we want you all to keep in mind. One is the safe harbor provision. So this is important to know, especially among the smaller LCCs that might only have 5 members. If you're ever in a position where someone's membership term is coming to an end, you could essentially enact this safe harbor provision, which would allow you to remain on the LCC while you're awaiting new appointments to be made. And then lastly, youth recruitment has been a really big topic. Shout out to my colleague Jay. The link that you see here, working with youth section, is an awesome blog post, and it subsequently became a section within our LCC toolkit, where we took a lot of information and interviewed and put a panel together of some LCCs that have done great work in recruiting youths to participate on their panel. So in that particular case, you also just want to check in with your municipality to see if there are any residency or age restrictions when it comes to being an LCC member. From the state's perspective, there is not. There might be, those might be in place locally. So just check with your municipalities about that. And next slide, please. All right, community. Oh, this is a hot topic. I love where we're going with this one. So this is actually fun. I'm really happy. We're really excited to kind of talk a little bit more about this. So essentially, LCCs need to conduct an annual community input process. And really the point of that is to engage with community members to collect diverse viewpoints about their community's resources, interests, and essentially you're trying to assess what the community needs within the context of the grants that you will eventually be deciding on. And then with that information, the goal is to use that to influence how you are establishing your local priorities and guidelines. Now, this is going to look dramatically different from one LCC to the next. For example, a larger city or a city with a larger population, it would make sense to conduct their community input process through, for example, an online survey like what you could see here on the screen. It's a great way to collect information from folks across the city, and it's an online survey, so it's all already documented. However, for a smaller LCC, a town with a much smaller population, that might not be the most effective method. So in those cases, you can also conduct community input by hosting, for example, community input meetings with what we call the cultural assets throughout your community. So who are kind of the key big players throughout your community that do a lot of cultural programming? So when we talk about that, we're thinking of things like public libraries, public schools, your local community television stations, things along those lines, your local YMCA folks, things like that. So just having deeper conversations with those particular types of entities is another way of collecting that input. Another great strategy that many of our other smaller towns practice is if you are within a town that does a lot of like big convenings, like big town fairs, getting a table at one of those types of events and tabling the event and just being able to naturally and organically engage with folks as they pass by is another way of kind of collecting this information. So what I like to share with my LCCs is if the process isn't fun, don't do it. This is really a way where you're able to kind of connect with folks in a manner and within a context that everyone is excited about. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't have to be limited to a typical survey. And that said, the link on the bottom where you can see community input section, that takes you to the spot on our toolkit where we actually have a lot of other different types of strategies and methods LCCs can consider doing. That said, we'll go to the next slide, please. All right, and like I mentioned, a lot of that community input work that you're doing, the intention behind that is to use it to influence essentially this part. So what are the local priorities and guidelines that you're going to adopt? So as many of you might already know, LCCs have to go ahead and submit their local priorities and guidelines to us by August 31st. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But essentially, these are the kinds of examples that we're talking about. So within the local guidelines section, that is where an LCC would want to talk about whether or not there's a particular dollar amount cap to an application. If LCCs want to limit the number of applications that an individual can submit, that's something that you would put into the guidelines section. Now, switching gears into local priorities now, this is really where you're able to prioritize certain types of programming or even certain types of applicants, again, based upon community input that you've received. So as an example, some LCCs will prioritize either BIPOC artists or BIPOC-centered work or organizations or individuals with disabilities or low-income folks, what have you. So the link on the bottom of this page has other questions that you can consider thinking about when you're talking about local guidelines and priorities. One thing to keep in mind, you don't have to actually have them. There are some folks, even after conducting community input, are fine using the state's default guidelines and criteria, which again, we'll talk about soon, shortly. So you don't actually have to enact your own and input them. So that was the other thing that we'll keep in mind. So we'll keep that there and we'll go to the next slide, please. All right, I'll pass it on
Okay.
to Jay.
Thank you, Greg. All right, so let's get into the LCC funds and money management. This is the heavyweight, so buckle up. It's a little intimidating, but we're here for you guys. So all LCC funds must be kept in a revolving account separate from all the other funds administered by your city or town specified by Mass General Law. Separate checkbooks or non-municipal accounts are not permitted. So please do keep everything in one account administered by your city or town. One thing I'd like to point out is to be mindful of your encumbered funds. These are the funds that accrue for various reasons, typically because previously approved programs or events were not completed. An LCC may not accumulate any unspent state funds at the local level. Any unspent state funds from prior fiscal years must be accounted for and reported to Mass Cultural Council when you're doing your financial reports. And we'll get into that in the next webinar in a few weeks. So we really want LCCs to do everything they can to spend down to the last dollar amount. There are a few things that your council can do for yourselves with your state allocation beyond just giving out grant awards. Part of that allocation can go towards administrative purposes. So you can use your 5%, you can use 5% of your allocation to hire a paid staff member to help you with paperwork or graphic designing for your social media outreach, printing flyers or tablecloths when you're tabling at community events to promote your LCC and the grant program. There's a lot of room to determine how your LCC would like to use your 5% for your council's specific needs. So you have that flexibility. Aside from that, you can also use up to 20% of your allocation to create your own council program. So essentially, this is giving your council a grant yourself so that you can host an event or a program for your community. A most recent example is the Sharon Cultural Council. They hosted their very first annual Chalk Art Festival in their community this past spring and was very successful. I love the pictures, they were beautiful. LCCs are also encouraged to leverage funds from outside resources other than the state. So this can include private contributions, your local government allocation, program revenues, event fees, and so on. We've seen quite a few LCCs in the past advocate for their municipalities to match MC's, like Mass Cultural Council's allocation, or even higher to continue supporting the arts and culture community. So it's crucial that you communicate that with your municipality to ensure that you're following proper procedures when it comes to receiving outside funds. And like I said, we will be hosting another webinar that will go into more details on money management and your financial report on September 12th. So save the date for that one. All right, so public communications. This is where local cultural councils can find creative ways to do outreach in your community. And this can be to promote the grant cycle, highlight current and previous grantees, host grant writing workshops, because some people, like new applicants, may not know how to go about the grant writing process, or this world is very new to them. So we've had LCCs host, introductory grant writing workshops. And you can also publicize your grant receptions and host, your council programs. And we do love to see local cultural councils outreach to new applicants who, like I said, are not aware of these grant programs and the resources available to them. So this is why we stress the importance of outreach to your communities in various ways, whether it's in person, using newspaper articles, your local television channels, or social media. All right, so grant payments. This is very important too. This is where your council will decide if you'd like to do reimbursement grants or direct grants. The reimbursement grants are paid to the grantees after their programs are completed. Essentially, grantees will have had to pay out of pocket or utilize other resources to complete their programs before receiving their local cultural council grant award. So this is a bit more of a burden on the grantee because they have to use their own funds or utilize outside resources.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Um,
Jay.
what?
We're on the grant making process slide.
Oh, no. Are we on that one?
Yeah, so I could take this
Oh,
one
that
as
was you. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
that's all right. That's all right.
Sorry, guys. I jumped ahead. I'll talk
No
about
worries.
this again.
No worries, no worries. Yeah, the slide that Jay started to discuss is actually, I think, two slides down. But yeah, just to kind of switch gears a little bit to talk about the grant making process. So, most LCCs by this point, if you're a new member, the LCC that you're serving on already might have a process for how they're actually guiding new LCC members and how to review applications as they come in. So that's pretty much all set. I seriously doubt that this is something that new folks or that new LCCs might be reimagining. So I won't go spend too much time on this particular section. But again, just kind of high level things. The grants that LCCs are determining to award, again, should address particular local cultural needs that you've gotten from the community input process. That is not to say that you are permitted from approving a grant that might not have had nothing to do with any input that you have received. You're still, LCCs have the autonomy to make those decisions themselves. One other key thing is grant awards should not be made under $250. At that point, unfortunately, it doesn't really become feasible for many applicants to even consider applying in the first place with an amount that's lower than that mark. Switching into application instructions, just a kind of general overview of how applications are being submitted. So applicants create an account in our grant management system, and as they are completing the LCC application, they are identifying the specific LCC where their application will go once they hit the submit button. So all applications are done through our online grant management system. We do not accept any paper or mailed applications. And now shifting into the application evaluating steps, the section, the link that's on the bottom of that page really kind of gives a good overview of this process. But essentially, as you're preparing, hypothetically, if we fast forward to October 16th, which is the deadline for the cycle, theoretically, then you're switching gears into this particular process. So the first thing that LCCs really want to go ahead and do is refresh all the LCC members who have voting privileges on what, if any, local criteria the LCC has, and also the state's criteria, which we're going to go over next. And then as part of the voting meeting preparation, you'll first want to go ahead and do an initial pass of all of the applications to determine eligibility. It doesn't make sense, as you all would agree, to evaluate an application that's ineligible. So first, just doing an initial pass to confirm eligibility. Within that process, you might decline a few applications simply because they're ineligible. And then at that point, there's a really cool feature within our online system where you can essentially create and export a panel book that we could help you do, and that's the information and the materials that you would send out to the rest of the voting members, along with any instructions you want to have them follow in that process. Next up, as you're kind of concluding the evaluation process, once you've made your particular decisions, you'll want to communicate with applications. None of that needs to be done from scratch. We are here to assure you we have plenty of templates and sample grant contract packages, for example, that you can tweak if you'd like, but a lot of those documentations are already kind of ready to go. You just have to go ahead and submit those. So there are automatic notifications that go through our online grants management system. So once applications are moved to approved or declined, there's an initial notification that they receive. But many LCCs send a more personalized email to, especially to the applicants who are there approving, that has the grant contract package and all of those details that we'll talk about in a little bit. And lastly, this is something that we practice very much ourselves, is to debrief the entire process. So once the cycle kind of concludes, the next meeting that you all schedule, and just kind of go ahead and discuss, what things you thought could be done better and what you should go ahead and change. It is, especially while it's still fresh in everyone's mind. That's a great way to kind of keep optimizing the practice and the process as you kind of keep working together. That said, we'll go to the next slide, please. All right, so applicant and project eligibility. So starting with the actual types of work. Well, first and foremost, let's acknowledge the deadline. So October 16th at 11:59 p.m. That is the deadline. After that, assuming that the systems do not crash, which actually did happen once before, that's a hard set deadline. There's nothing that can be done. So if an applicant doesn't meet that deadline and hit that submit button, their application won't be reviewed. Going into the types of work. So what are some of the types of projects and programs that are eligible to be funded? Again, a lot of these things are at the discretion of LCCs, but in terms of types of grants, I have a short list here that I wanted to go ahead and share with you. So these are many different types of things. It's not an exhaustive list, but just to name a few, some of the things that we see quite often are in the realm of fellowships, artist residencies, public art, ticket subsidies, field trips. In some cases, you don't even have to, it doesn't have to be an actual project. LCCs can also decide to just give general operating support to an applicant. So this is definitely an area where LCCs have the autonomy to kind of make those decisions for themselves. Shifting into grant amounts. So we did mention that the minimum grant award really should not be below 250. Within a lot of the links here that we have to the LCC toolkit, there are certain things that LCCs can decide to do in the realm of partial funding. So hypothetically, if an applicant is applying for $1,000, if it's an application that the LCC would like to fund, but it still wants to distribute its funding as widely as possible, that's another thing that the LCC can consider doing as well. So we have more information linked in this document. I won't spend too much time on that. Lastly, the general timeline, especially for this upcoming cycle, an applicant is submitting a project, if you will, within the timeline of January 1st of 24 all the way through December 31st of 2025. So that's the general timeline for the LCC program. However, LCCs can narrow that if they like. That is up to you all to decide to do that. Shifting into applicant eligibility, honestly, it's a much shorter list if I just tell you that essentially anyone is eligible. As you could see here, individuals, which include folks acting as sole proprietors, are eligible. Nonprofit organizations, for-profit corporations, unincorporated groups. One thing that I think it's important to note, if it is an incorporated group, a lot of times you'll see bands operating as an unincorporated group. If they apply and you decide to award them funding, one of the things that you might get asked is, and this really kind of depends upon what your municipal laws are, but the tax implications might be a thing. And in the past, it would need to be one particular member of that unincorporated group that would need to be named on the documents that you're sending to them. So that might be something to kind of keep in mind. And lastly, tribal, federal, and state municipal entities, of which we see applied to this program quite frequently, are also eligible to apply. And again, some of the things linked below this, the eligibility and criteria section elaborates on a lot of these things further. We also have here a link to the FAQs that we most often receive from applicants. In general, what we like to do is encourage all applicant questions to be sent to us. Anything that's very general, or if it's a technical issue, something that we can very easily resolve, we want to mitigate that burden from you and answer those questions. Really, ideally, the only questions that should be coming your way from applicants are the ones that have to do with any local criteria that you've adopted. In those cases, you all can speak much more thoroughly on your own local criteria than we could. So that's how we try to divvy up and route inquiries to be sent. And then lastly, the applicant outreach and engagement section has a great amount of information pertaining to how you can support applicants throughout the cycle. One of the most common ways of doing that is hosting grant writing workshops, which we kind of elaborate a little bit further in that last link. And I'll keep it there. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the default grant criteria for the LCC program. So assuming that LCCs do not elect their own local criteria, then by default, this is essentially what you are committing to. So first and foremost, and actually had a conversation with an LCC member earlier today about this. So all LCC funds, regardless of the source of funding, must be used towards the arts, humanities, and sciences. A great question that I was asked by a member today is, all right, so how do you define arts, humanities, and sciences? We're thinking of funding this particular type of work, or we're not sure if it meets the definition. So we've linked how we define these terms here beside the one. But that said, LCCs are encouraged to essentially reference the most broadest sense of these definitions. Again, you have the autonomy to determine this for yourselves. However, across the board, any questions, feel free to reach out. The second point is attributed to what we call public benefit. So essentially, LCC funds must support activities that contribute to the cultural vitality of a community rather than benefiting an individual, a private individual, or a private group. There's there's a lot of interpretation around that. As an example, there are some LCCs that don't want to fund projects that come from public schools because they feel that that programming is only benefiting the students of that particular school and it's not wide enough. Other LCCs are completely fine with funding public schools. So again, that's a great example of something that LCCs have the autonomy to make that distinction. But again, by and large, you want to make sure that the decisions that you're making are benefiting as broad an audience as possible within the community. Third, this is common sense, I believe. Really, you want to abide by all anti-discrimination laws. And lastly, if you have your own local guidelines, that's the last criteria there. But just to address the third bullet here, this link, the accessibility compliance tools for grantees, is to one of the New England Endowment for the Arts websites. It really has a great framework for how applicants can essentially evaluate their own accessibility. So that's something that's really good to just kind of have at your fingertips. We also have linked here our own access policy. If anyone reaches out to you with accessibility needs, whether it's translation, what have you, we're here to support your ability to provide them with whatever accessibility needs they may have. And then the third link, we actually held an Accessibility 101 for LCC's webinar quite recently. So the link here is a recording to that as well. And that's set. I will go to the next slide, please.
Okay, now it's back to me. So now we're going to go into grant payments. Like I already mentioned, there are two grant payments. There's the reimbursement grant and then the direct grants. Like I said before, the reimbursement grants are paid to the grantees after their programs or events are completed. So essentially, grantees have to pay out of pocket or utilize other resources to complete their programs. And this is why this type of grant payment can be a little bit of a burden on the grantee to come up with their own funds to complete their projects. The other type is the direct grants. This option provides the grantees with the funds upfront before they host their program or event. This has been the most beneficial, not only to the grantee to have their funds readily available, but it's also easier on the administrative side for LCC members in terms of paperwork. So that's always a benefit too. You can contact your designated program officer to let them know if you'd like to go with direct grants by August 31st. And you will also declare which grant option that you are going with, whether it's reimbursement or direct grants, when you're uploading your priorities and guidelines in Smart Simple, again, by August 31st. Okay, compliance. Greg kept talking about compliance, the fun part, but not really. So, compliance. Anyone serving on a municipal or state board must comply with state laws. First is the open meeting law. One of the great things is that you can still meet online virtually. This has been pushed to March 31st, 2025. So you're still covered to meet virtually. If guys have any questions, you can find more about the open meeting law on our LCC guidelines or more on the mass.gov website. The second one is the conflict of interest law. This is probably the most important one. This training is a requirement for all newly appointed LCC members. It's important to do this before your voting meeting. The conflict of interest law is a really big thing that you should be aware of. We do have a very robust definition in our guidelines, but if you're ever worried that if something is a conflict of interest or not, you can contact the State Ethics Commission, who also has a lawyer for the day to answer any of your questions. But when it comes to this, you cannot call the State Ethics Commission on behalf of somebody else. It has to serve just you as an individual. And then thirdly, there's the public records law. Nothing has changed on this end, but the only part that I would point out is that the local cultural councils must keep records available within the past 6 years, just in case there is a public records request, which some LCCs do get. All right, let's go over a little bit of the timeline. This is just our general grant cycle timeline, but this timeline will keep you on track of what the council should be doing and the deadlines to meet month by month. The main dates that I do want to point out are August 31st. Again, your priorities and guidelines should be entered into Smart Simple in order for it to post on our website. If it's not submitted by August 31st, the priorities and guidelines are not going to be published on our website. So if a grantee comes to the Mass Cultural Council website and they don't see that any of your priorities and guidelines are uploaded, they're just going to have to go by Mass Cultural Council's guidelines. And this is also the date, again, to let us know if you are going to choose direct grants or not. The second one is September 1st. That's when the grant cycle opens. So please, utilize this time to really publicize that the grant applications is open and to encourage as many people as possible to apply to the LCC grant program. The next one is October 16th. This is the deadline for the grant applications to be submitted. Applicants cannot submit applications after October 16th at 11:59 p.m. This date is also when your financial reports are due. And like I said, there will be another webinar on financial reporting in a few weeks. And then between November and December, LCC should be holding their voting meetings to go through all the grant applications and decide who will get a grant award and who will not. And finally, January 16th is the deadline to submit your grant decisions report, your annual report. And we'll be with you, guiding you through this entire timeline the whole time. Oh, yeah, that's the next timeline. Okay, beyond expectations. So none of these are required, but they're highly, highly recommended. Just to highlight a few things here, you can find more information on hosting a council program, ideas for it, how to strategize for it, grant receptions that a lot of councils do after the grant cycle. More information is on that on our website. You can also find a section on strategies on how to advocate for arts and culture in your communities. So that goes by what I mentioned earlier about some LCCs have advocated for their municipalities to match funding. So that's a big part of it. And then a new one is the municipal relationship. This is a new page that we created, and it just kind of talks about how to strengthen and build stronger relationships with your local government. You'll see webinars on there that we did with the Mass Municipal Association, and you'll hear elected officials talking about the importance of advocating for arts and culture and uplifting that community. Back to Greg.
All right, and just to kind of wrap things up, these are just additional resources that we thought it would be beneficial to compile to one page. Some of these, all of these actually, Jay had mentioned, but just to go through them again, the LCCs have to update their local guidelines and priorities by August 31st. That link there is to a pre-recorded walkthrough where we actually kind of log into the system and go through and show members on how to actually navigate that particular report and how to go through it, how to submit it. Below that, and as part of that process, LCCs want to make sure that they update their member list before they submit that report because it's part of it. So there's a separate 90-second video that our wonderful Carolyn had put together. Same thing, just kind of walking through how to create new members, how to add them to your member list. And then below that, the Toolkit's online grant management system actually, or section, actually has a couple different walkthrough recordings on various things. I mean, kind of a step-by-step fashion. So just referencing that particular page is helpful. We are going to have a live applicant info session on Thursday, September 5th at 6 p.m. You are welcome to share that registration link that we have here throughout, to your constituents, throughout your networks to get prospective applicants to apply. And just like this recording, we are going to post it onto our YouTube channel, like all of our recordings after the fact. And after that, we're going to be hosting a financial reporting webinar that'll also be live. And essentially, we're going to walk through, in particular, this is the person who would likely be the treasurer of the LCC or the chair. It could be anyone, really. We're going to walk you all through the process of essentially completing that financial report that we sent to your municipalities, either the CFO, the tax accountant, whoever's kind of been identified as that point person. And the goal is that once you kind of go through that financial reporting process, you know how much money you have allotted or available to do grant making, essentially. And that, and you could go ahead and register there for that as well. The deadline to submit that financial report is October 16th, which is the same deadline for applicants to submit their LCC application. After that, we have a pre-recorded walkthrough for how to go through the grant decisions report, which that isn't due until January 16th. So I'm sure we'll provide much more follow-up as we get closer to that point. And then lastly, the Toolkit's guidelines and forms section. Every single template or sample document, whether it's an Excel file, a Word document, or PDF, what have you, is all concentrated there, including the LCC Program Guidelines document. So a lot of things you could definitely find there, but in general, like we've mentioned, whatever it is you need help with, there is no silly question. We are literally here. We are paid staff members to help you. So whatever it is you need, we have your back. This should be fun. Don't try to take anything on yourself. If it's stressful, feel free to call us in. This should be a fun process throughout the entirety of it. So I just wanted to echo that before we kind of conclude this presentation, but that's the last point here. So we'll go to the last slide and we will open it up for questions.
Jay and Greg, there was a question about the timeline for approval or denial of applications.
Jay, do you want to cover that one?
That should be happening during your voting meeting when it comes to approving and denying applications. So between November and December, the application deadline is October 16th, but relatively a lot of the LCCs give, a week or, a couple of weeks between their voting meeting so that the LCC members can start, reading through the applications. They all have their own process of how they review applications. But yeah, between November and December and during that voting meeting is when you make those decisions.
And did you see the question in the chat? You'd mentioned helping in putting together a panel booklet or guideline from Jeannie?
Yes, so I'll cover that. I spoke to that briefly. So it's that's actually a really nice feature that's already built into our grant management system. Essentially, it's literally a button that you push that'll export all of the applications that were submitted to your LCC into a panel book. And then that's essentially the PDF document that you can distribute to all of your voting members. So once we get closer to that, we could go ahead and show you all how to go ahead and do that. Yeah, it's a really helpful way of just kind of compiling it and sending it out quite quickly.
To Leilani's point, are there any recommendations or best practices related to making funding decisions? We frequently have more requests than we have dollars to cover, even when opting for partial funding. That's the biggest challenge, is there never seems to be enough money, and usually year by year, as you guys are publicizing the grant program here, you get a lot more applicants. But this kind of goes back into the priorities and guidelines of, and the community input survey on what your community wants to see, because it's about them, not about us. So it's kind of going off of the community input survey and what your priorities are. We've had some councils also kind of create like a secondary list, like, even though we couldn't approve your program this year, here's some additional resources or other grant programs that you can look forward to. Because fall is around the time that all of Mass Cultural Council's grant programs open up. But there's also, the other resources that they can utilize as well. So putting a list together for them is very helpful.
And I could add a little bit to that. I just had a conversation along those lines earlier today. If the LCC, if the voting members are genuinely kind of stuck on how to kind of move forward within any process of any of your responsibilities, but in particular to deciding on who to fund and at what amounts, etc., if it is helpful just to kind of bring one of us in to just kind of hear our take. We're not here to tell you all what to do. We're here to guide you all in the work that you do. So again, you have the autonomy to make the decisions, but in some cases it is good to kind of get an outside perspective just to make sure that you're thinking things through in a different way. Sometimes that kind of helps with the decision, just to kind of hear a different take on it. So for anything that you all have to do, if you're stuck on how to move forward, feel free to reach out to one of us. That's what we're here for. So to just kind of give you our input and to share what other LCCs are doing. We're fortunate to be in a situation where what you might be stuck with isn't necessarily new. We probably have 4, 5, 6, 7 other LCCs that have dealt with a similar issue. So we have a lot of kind of testimony in how other LCCs have navigated certain things. So again, if you do feel like you are stuck on moving forward in any particular way, again, feel free to reach out to us and we could help just share what other folks have done to help you make that decision for yourselves.
We had a question, to go back to the timeline question, we had a question about when in the year LCC members should be poking their municipal partners about the contracting process.
In terms of getting their allocation or the financial reporting?
Yes, getting their allocation. Yes. So when a LCC member is saying, I would love to help our municipality make sure they're getting the DocuSigns and everything, what time of year do I need to make sure I'm doing that?
So the process has changed a bit. And I believe Lisa was checking in with Jen, but I would start poking them around the time of your voting meeting, just to kind of get the ball rolling, just to kind of put it on their radar that, hey, we're wrapping up our voting meeting. We've already made our grant decisions. We're about to submit our grant decisions and annual report. So we'd like to make sure that we have all our ducks in a row with getting, making sure that you guys have received your contracts from Mass Cultural Council, so that if there's any delays or anything of them not receiving the paperwork, you can come back to us and we'll kind of pick up the speed. So yeah, I would say around like your voting meeting time, so November, December.
And I will just add, thank you, Jay. That was a really great way of putting that. Yes, as soon as you decide where to give the money, you start looking for next year's money. I also wanted to bring up in the timeline, I totally forgot what I was saying. I'm so sorry. Never mind.
It's okay.
I was just so caught up in how well you answered that question. Oh, I remember. I'm sorry. It's just encouraging everyone to make sure that they have signed up as an LCC member in the GMS system, because that's where you will get the news and to-dos that Summers puts together. It comes directly from the Smart Simple GMS system. And it will have those kinds of reminders that it's time to be poking your municipal partners. It will have backups of links that you need at the time that you need them. So it's very important to sign up and have access to the GMS system so you get those kind of reminders, as well as being able to go in and interact with your applications.
Thank you, Cheyenne. All right, with that being said, we're going to close out the webinar for tonight. If you have any questions along the way, or if you're not able to get your questions in now, please, like I said, reach out to us. We're here for you throughout the entire way. But I want to thank everybody for joining us, and please save the dates for the next webinars. Those are very, very crucial webinars beyond ours. So thank you again. Have a wonderful night, everyone.